Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 15th CEPR EAERE Webinar on Climate Policy. This webinar is entitled Economic Analysis of the New US Discounting System. In November last year, the OSOMB has published a new version of Circular A4 and Circular A94 that contain in particular a new discounting system for public policy evaluation. The new risk-free discount rate is now fixed in the United States at 2% in real terms, whereas it is also proposed to use a risk-adjusted discount rate of 3.1%. Compared to the earlier, much larger discount rates used in that country, this reform is likely to make the American society more long-termist, in particular in the domain of environmental protection and climate change. This webinar will offer three critical analyses of the underlying approach which led to the reform and of its consequences. Given the relevance of the US discounting system as a reference for other countries, I think that a serious discussion on these issues is key for how our public institution in the free world will value the future in the coming years. To discuss these issues, I invited three worldwide experts on discounting with a special focus on North America. Let me briefly describe them. So David Anthoff is an associate professor in the Energy and Resource Group at the University of California at Berkeley and a university fellow at Resource for the Future. He's an environmental economist who studies climate change and environmental policy. He co-develops the integrated assessment model GIVE and FUND that are widely used in academic research and in policy analysis. Marcel Boyer is Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Montreal. He received many academic awards around the world for his scientific achievement in industrial economics, environmental economics, and contract theory. His last book, published 6 months ago, is entitled Social Democracy, Capitalism, and Competition. Jim Hammitt is Professor of Economics and Decision Sciences at the Center for Risk Analysis at Harvard University. His research concerns the developments and application of benefit-cost analysis, decision theory, and risk analysis to health and environmental policies. Topics include management of long-term environmental issues with important scientific uncertainties. He has served on 6 National Academies of Science panels and more than a dozen advisory committees to the US Environmental Protection Agency and other government agencies. So thank you for your participation. Thank you for your participation today to this webinar. Let me check. Jim, could you switch off your mic before your presentation? So without any further introduction, let me give the floor to our first panelist, David Anthoff, who will make his contribution for the next 20 minutes. Thank you, David. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me here. This is a very exciting webinar, and let me also try to get my slides up. I think you should see them. Can someone confirm that you can see my slides?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, so I will probably talk a little bit more on the consequences of the new discounting scheme, and in particular what it means for the climate space. So my plan here is that I will talk about half the time a little bit about the new social cost of carbon estimate that the US federal government is using now. And then I will dive into some more detail about the discounting and risk valuation in the social cost of carbon, and I will relate that back to the new recommendations in the memo, in the A4 memo that you mentioned at the beginning. But I'll start Just giving folks a bit of an overview of what happened on the social cost of carbon front in the last couple of years. So just as a definition, the social cost of carbon is the harm caused if we put up 1 extra ton of CO2 into the atmosphere in economic terms. So it might be something like $190 per ton of CO2 that you put into the atmosphere. And you use that in a cost-benefit analysis of regulation, for example. And the United States had an official social cost of carbon since about 2010, at the beginning of the Obama administration. In 2017, the National Academies of Sciences had a panel publish a roadmap for a next generation of social cost of carbons. And I think actually Jim was on that panel, if I recall that correctly. Then there was an administration change. It was pretty clear that during the Trump administration, those recommendations would not be implemented. And so there were 2 large-scale non-government research efforts that worked on major new social cost of carbon estimates. One was the Climate Impact Lab, and the other one was a joint Berkeley Resources for the Future Social Cost of Carbon initiative. And I was part of that second one. And both of those had the goal of producing new social cost of carbon estimates that would follow the advice from the National Academies panel. And then EPA started working with both of these groups, so us, the Berkeley RFF group, and the Climate Impact Lab under the Biden administration, with a goal to update the official social cost of carbon for the US with the new work that these 2 groups had done in the meantime. They published a draft social cost of carbon at the end of 2022. There was a peer review period, so there was an external peer review committee that reviewed all that work. There was a public comment period where anyone can comment on the new SEC, and then the EPA has to respond to all of those. So that all happened after they had published the draft. And then interestingly enough, in parallel, the first draft for the update to A4, which is the document that in general is the guideline for the US government on how to do cost-benefit analysis, a new draft of that was published in the summer of 2023. But the timeline here was that the new SEC was actually, the draft was published first, before the draft for how to do this kind of stuff came out. And the new A4 was actually finalized just very briefly before the SEC was finalized. And then the final SEC, new SEC came out at the end of 2023. So one question is, did this make any difference? Did it matter? And it did quite a bit. So the first generation SEC, so the SEC that was sort of the one at the before the new work started, was about $50 per ton of CO2 emissions. And the new central estimate from these new efforts is now about $190 per ton of CO2. So this was not David,
it was for the year 2020. So today, yes. 2024, it should be around 220, something like that, no?
Yeah, so they publish numbers for 2020 and 2030, and then you have to interpolate for any year in between. I don't have the number for 2030 in the back of my mind right now, and I refuse to admit that it's already that we're halfway towards 2030 already, but these are numbers for 2020. Yeah, you're right. But I think the main message here is this was not we tinker at the edges, okay? This was sort of a major change. I've lived in the US now for 14 years, and so I've internalized the value of advertising. So what I want to do next is I want to just give you a brief shout out to all the people that worked on the RFF Berkeley initiative and that stream. So especially for economics, I think it was a really large team that worked on this. This is everyone who contributed to our new social cost of carbon estimate. And you can see we have domain experts from many different areas. That was sort of one of the goals, that we wanted to assemble a team where we have demographers working on demography and sort of, experts on each domain, and then we bring it all together. The central number, or the central social cost of carbon from the RFF Berkeley team, was published in Nature. This is the paper. If you like it, please cite it. But that is sort of the main academic publication that lays that work out. What EPA, though, did is they used 3 different numbers for their studies. I want to give you a bit of a peek under the hood what that is. So the GIVE number is the one from the Berkeley RFF initiative. That's our integrated assessment model. The DSIM number is the number from the Climate Impact Lab. And then they had a third number from where they used a different damage function by Howard and Sterner that was a meta-analysis. And so they came up with these 3 social cost of carbons and then are using an average as their central estimate. There are differences and commonalities between these 3 numbers, and I want to say a little bit about that right now. So all of these 3 estimates use the same socioeconomic probabilistic scenarios that we developed as the resources for the future socioeconomic projections. So those are probabilistic projections of population, economic growth, and emissions. And that is commonly used for all 3 of these models. On the climate science side, the DSIM model uses a version of FAIR and then their own sea level rise model. And then we and the meta-analysis number use the FAIR climate model as well, and our own sea level rise model. So all 3 really use the FAIR climate model, which is the same climate model that IPCC used for the 6th assessment report. So I think for a while, the economic science was not really in line with some of the natural sciences, and I think that is solved. I think we're just using fantastic but run-of-the-mill climate model now for those parts. The real difference between the 3 models is in the damage functions. The DSIM model uses its own damage functions. We use our own damage functions. And then the Howard and Sterner meta-analysis is yet a third independent damage function again. There's one commonality between the DSIM and GIVE damage functions. We both use the same sea level rise damage function that is called CM, that was created by Delavan Diaz as part of her PhD. But other than that, the damage functions, I think, are actually really quite independent this time around. And then for discounting, we essentially all 3 use a version of the consumption capital asset pricing model. I think one thing that was very surprising to everyone involved here is that these numbers ended up being so close to each other, because the work certainly between Climate Impact Lab and us was really independent. We did not cross-check. We did not, compare numbers and then say, oh, we are too far apart. That did not happen. Now these are rounded, these numbers, so I think they're rounded to the next to the tens. But it is a miracle how that is so close to each other.
David, we don't see the 3 numbers very well because they are too low, too low in the slide. So yeah. Could you tell us what the numbers are? So
I can.
I see the 200 on the right, but I don't see the other 2 numbers. It looks like 100 and 100, but probably not that.
It's 190 for DSIM, and it's 190 for GIVE and 200 for the meta-analysis.
Okay, wow, that's impressive to close there. Indeed.
Now that is, remember, it's only up to the tens. It's rounded. Okay, so but still, this is, anyone who's familiar with this literature will be. This is really surprising. All right, let me one more bit of advertising, and then I'll move to another topic. My group at Berkeley has worked on a computational platform for building integrated assessment models for many years, where you can essentially take all these different components like Lego pieces and reassemble them. And all the GIVE and meta-analysis work was used on that platform. And if you want to work on social cost of carbon, climate, numerical modeling, then I encourage you to take a look, because we have many more models implemented on this platform, and it makes it quite easy to not just use one model, but use many models for your work. Okay, so that was a brief overview over where we are with social cost of carbon in the United States. And now what I wanted to do is I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the discounting and risk valuation choices in the GIVE model, which is the model from RFF and Berkeley. But that is essentially also a description of the US EPA effort because they adopt that's the same approach. Yeah. All right. So I'll just, and I should say this part will have equations. But I will try hard to because I think this audience is maybe not all Christian Gollier's. So I will try to verbally explain what that means in a way that is hopefully...
Equation are okay. Go ahead, David.
Yeah. Okay. So here, this is the general approach we use. We have the social cost of carbon is the expected discounted stream of marginal damages that are caused by an emission in the present. So this MD here are the marginal damages from now until the time horizon of the problem, which is 300 years. And then we use a discount factor here that is essentially a Ramsey-like discount factor with a twist here, because take note that all of this is happening inside one big expectation operation. The things that are uncertain here is the marginal damages. So that's a random variable. And then also the per capita growth rate GT here is also a random variable because that is probabilistic in our setting. For the rest of this presentation, I will use a different notation. I will just call the discount factor M and the marginal damages X, and I will probably call the marginal damages the payoff quite often, and then M just a stochastic discount factor. So that's essentially the equation that we're using to price these marginal damages. And this is sort of standard capital asset pricing equation. Now, I want to highlight the relationship of that to the risk-free discount factor that one could also use. So one approach that one could use here is one could say, let's take our expected marginal damages and discount them at the risk-free rate. And Christian already mentioned that that is sort of about 2% now in the official guidance. So what that would be is the risk-free discount factor is just the expected stochastic discount factor. And in GIVE, we can compute that, and we can output what in our model what the risk-free discount rate is. And that's what I've plotted here. So it starts at 2% and then it falls over time until the year 2300. So this is essentially the story of declining discount rates. If you have uncertainty about your economic growth, then the risk-free discount rate will decline over time. And we do find that in our model. And we often talk about the risk-free discount rate in GIVE that it is 2%. And what we mean by that is that we report this number here. But it's if you know your math, then you also know that if you take expected payoffs or expected marginal damages and discount them with this risk-free discount factor, that is not in general equal to the equation that we're using to discount here, right? That would only be equal if the covariance between the stochastic discount factor and the payoff is 0. And to say that in other words, that would only be equivalent if there's no correlation between the damages, the marginal damages, and the stochastic discount factor. And so another way to say this is that you really only should use the risk-free discount rate to discount your marginal damages if the marginal damages are not correlated with your stochastic discount factor. And that is not the case, okay? So the marginal damages are highly correlated with the stochastic discount factor. I think that I don't know of any work that would suggest anything else. So in general, conceptually, it would be just wrong to use the risk-free discount rate to discount marginal damages for something like the social cost of carbon. Instead, what essentially implicitly happens is that if we use our equation up here, that implicitly means that we're using some kind of risk-adjusted discount factor to discount expected marginal damages. And we can back that risk-adjusted discount rate out of our model, and that's what I'm going to show you next. So this is the slide here. It still has the risk-free discount rate as the blue line plotted here, But if you back out what the actual discount rate is that is used to discount expected marginal damages in the GIVE model, then it's this red line here, and that is actually increasing, okay? So very different from, I think, what a lot of people have as an intuition. What happens in GIVE and in the US EPA work right now is that expected marginal damages are discounted at an increasing discount rate that is higher than the risk-free rate. I want to say the same thing in yet another way to express this. You can also talk about this phenomenon in terms of risk premia. So we can also say that this is an equivalent way to do discounting. We can discount the expected payoff, the expected marginal damages at the risk-free rate, but then we need to add a risk premium into the mix here. And the risk premium is the covariance between the stochastic discount factor and the marginal damages. And if we plot those separately, then you can see that here. So the blue line is expected marginal damages. And then the red line here is the covariance. So that's the risk premium. And so the key thing that I want to point out here is that the risk premium on the social cost of carbon here is negative, which is, I think, very different so some people know this. Christian knows this because he published the first paper, I think, that pointed this out. But I think it's not a result that is widely known. Okay, so let me summarize things a little bit here. We often report the risk-free discount rate from the GIVE model. So we say, oh, if you use a near-term discount rate of 2%, then the SEC is this. But that is really just reporting what the risk-free rate in the model is for a given calibration. What actually happens under the hood is that we then use a risk-adjusted discount rate implicitly in the model. And we do not discount the expected marginal damages at the risk-free rate. So that's important to note. And I think we probably could have communicated that a little bit clearer in our work. Yeah, so we're discounting at an increasing discount rate here. And that is equivalent to a negative risk premium. I just want to sort of highlight one interesting point here. Sometimes people bring up the insurance analogy on the social cost of carbon, that we should think about the risk associated with the social cost of carbon as in an insurance context. But really, if you have the framing that I've shown you today, it's not like insurance at all. It's quite the opposite, because if we reduce emissions, if we invest in emission reduction today, then the uncertain payoffs are structured such that we get more benefits in states of the world where we're better off already. And that is not what how we normally think about insurance. So that I think that's actually not I think that's almost a misleading analogy for the social cost of carbon and the risk in particular.
David, this is not in your Nature paper, is it? This explanation
No.
of the positive climate beta and this
No.
discussion of the last 2 or 3 slides that you just presented, that's not there. And you have no paper on that?
No,
I think it's important.
Yeah, I think, so I think Brian Prest has written, Brian Prest is a collaborator at RFF on that, and I think he has written up something about some of these topics. And I've written a memo to EPA about all of this with a lot of helpful phone calls with you, Christian. But I don't think we have any real published thing about this out right now. Okay, but I should say, I think, I think these are not novel results. I think, Christian, you have published papers with, in principle, all of these results.
But it was using DICE. It was not using GIVE. So it's not the same result.
Yeah. No, we will publish something about this, but I just want to make sure, okay. I think the original person to discover this was actually you, not us.
So could you, David, could you finish in 2 or 3 minutes?
Yeah, I have one more slide and then I'm done. Okay. So I just want to sort of really quickly to the relationship to the new A4, the discounting guidelines. In A4, they have 2 recommendations how you might deal with risk valuation. So one is that they say you can compute certainty equivalence and then of uncertain payoffs, and then discount those at the risk-free rate. And that's what I think their preferred method is. And that's a fine way to do it if you get the computation of the certainty equivalence right, which is not easy, maybe something to discuss later on. Or they also allow the use of risk-adjusted discount rates. They also say that that can also be done. So technically, we do neither here, which is quite hilarious because we use a stochastic discount factor directly in our work. But because all of these ways of doing things are really under the hood equivalent, I think we are in practice very much aligned with the new discounting guidelines in A4. I think that there's consistency between what they recommend and what EPA put out. We just use a slightly different math approach to do it, but I think conceptually there is really no big difference here. And with that, I only went over almost 3 minutes, and I apologize for that. Thank you.
Oh, David, thank you so much. Well, you were very pedagogical. I like very much your presentation of the methodology of the stochastic discount factor as an alternative to the consumption-based capital asset pricing model and the estimation of the beta, which is valuable only if we make an assumption of a geometric Brownian motion and that generate the standard function, the puzzles of asset pricing theory. So, okay, without further discussion about that, because I'm sure we will have more time at the end. And dear participants, let me be clear on that. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the 3 presentations. So you will have plenty of time to raise questions about this presentation and the other forthcoming presentation. Our next presenter is Marcel Boyer. Marcel, the floor is yours. You have no slides. It's fine.
That's right. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this very exciting but challenging webinar. I would like to say that the comments I'm going to make today are in part based on comments that Christian and I expressed and sent in June 2023 following the request for comments by the Office of Management and Budget based on A4 and A94. We express our support to the OMB's effort to improve the cost-benefit analysis. And we said that the methodologies developed in A4 and A94 are certainly significant tools for better decision-making and more responsible management of public funds. However, we wanted to express some concerns about how risk is integrated in the proposed new procedures. And I would like to say that David has set the bar very high, and I'm afraid that I may not go over it. I mean, but in any case, I think it's going to be complementary, and I'm going to develop some elements that he addressed at the end of his presentation. But first, a caveat I would like to express that the evaluation of regulatory policies and public programs and investments is a complex task. And although analysts and decision makers must be aware of analytical refinements underlying such evaluations, it is understandable that not all such refinements can be taken into account in all cases. Shortcuts are unavoidable. And the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget officials, are to be commended, I think, for having been quite transparent in Circular A4 and A94 regarding these unavoidable shortcuts. But we may still disagree about the way the implementation procedures of evaluation principles and refinements are designed. And this is going to be the object of my talk. So we express 5 concerns regarding the procedures that are developed in the circulars A4 and A94. The first one relates to estimating the social cost of public funds on the basis of the interest rate paid of government debt, for instance, on treasury notes of different maturities. This is the source of numerous and pervasive analytical errors in evaluating public projects. And we see it all the time in academia, in public sector and private sector, that people claim that it would be less costly if the government would finance some projects, even in the private sector or private sector run projects, because they can borrow at a cheaper rate than the private sector. This is an error, which is due to the fact that the government can borrow at a relatively low rate, namely the risk-free rate, because it can offer lenders a relatively riskless financial contract, because it has the option of raising taxes or reducing services, the quantity and quality of services, if necessary, to repay the lenders. And this financial option the government has, can exercise, is costly for citizens, taxpayers. Citizens are consumers of public services, and taxpayers as the financiers behind the operations of the government. The risk borne by citizens and taxpayers due to government actions and projects is too often swept under the carpet. It is not related to specific projects. It is rather a budgetary risk, but it is no less real, as numerous examples around us show. Now, what is OMB saying about this this cost of financing and discount rate and so on? There is no statement in A4 and A94 telling agencies to discount policies or projects at the treasury rate or the riskless rate, unless the policy or project has a zero systematic risk level. The OMB prefers, as David said, a risk-free discounting of certainty equivalent benefits and costs approach to a risk-adjusted discounting of expected benefits and costs approach. And the OMB recognizes that several commenters argue that the calculation of certainty equivalent values that capture systematic risk is impractical and more difficult relative to applying a more standard risk-adjusted discount rate. But the OMB claims that calculation of regulation-specific risk-adjusted discount rates is no less difficult than the calculation of certainty equivalent values. And in fact, the OMB claims that agencies may have experience that is more relevant to calculating certainty equivalent benefits and costs that capture systematic risk than in determining a risk-adjusted discount rates. And therefore, as one commenter mentioned, the only grounds for choosing one over the other are practical rather than conceptual. In theory, both approaches would lead to the same decisions, but which one is more practical and flexible? The OMB thinks that the certainty equivalent approach is more practical and flexible, according, at least from its own point of view, including the agency's point of view. And in fact, even though it seems that private firms use more frequently a risk-adjusted discounting of expected benefits and costs than a risk-free discounting of certainty equivalent benefits and costs, in reality, in the private sector, it is not done, it is not the exclusive approach. And once the risk-adjusted discounting of expected benefits and costs is done on a particular project, the higher up management in private firms will in fact apply some kind of a consideration of what would look like a certainty equivalent approach in qualifying and sometimes going against the recommendation of its division doing the risk-adjusted discounting of expected benefits and costs of projects. So it's not as clear as there. In a sense, there is no conflict between the OMB and the commenters on this issue, except that there is a preference for one methodology by the OMB, which is in a sense contrary to the majority of commenters on this issue, although everyone agrees that both methodologies would lead to similar decisions if done properly. A second concern that we raise in our comments is the fact that many policies do in fact, in particular, the strategic oil, mask, vaccine reserves, or raising military defense, investing in adaptation to climate change, or improving hurricane-resistant constructions, for example, reduce systematic risk in a sense. So they are in particular generating benefits when the situation is worse. And therefore, they have what we would call a negative beta. And because people are risk averse in general, the public decision procedure should value this collective risk reduction as if it resulted from an insurance contract. And here I use that, although David said that that may not be the proper comparable point, but against bad outcomes in states of the world. And therefore, in such a case, the risk-adjusted discount rate would be less than the risk-free discount rate that is being used. And that would be also compatible with the teaching, I would say, of financial economists. Some may consider the approach of discounting risky projects at a lower rate than the risk-free rate as counterintuitive, but it is nevertheless the proper approach to follow, as suggested by the capital asset pricing model or the consumption capital asset pricing model. The OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, claims that for many regulations, an appropriate risk premium adjustment to the discount rate would be negligible or negative, as many regulations provide their largest value to society when mitigating the harms of a number of risks or market inefficiencies in bad states of the world. That is a claim of the OMB, and therefore the suggestion, in a sense, that we can get out of the A4 and A94 that the OMB would favor a riskless discounting of expected benefits and costs, because in fact, the projects or the policies, regulations that are studied are likely to have a zero beta or a negative beta. Similarly, if costs are riskier, they should be discounted at a higher risk-adjusted discount rate. So costs are higher in good states of the world, and they are lower in bad states of the world. Hence, their discounted value would be smaller if they are riskier, thereby raising the value of the project. This often appears counterintuitive to many business people I have encountered, who sometimes resort to an ad hoc treatment to raise the discounted value of riskier costs above their risk-adjusted discounted value. And I've seen that, and I documented that in a paper published in 2022. So in a sense, the riskier the cost, the higher the value of the project. And therefore, this appears counterintuitive, but it is in fact, again, the lesson taught by financial economists. The Office of Management and Budget stresses the fact that a number of commenters on A4 and A94 emphasize that OMB's guidance should not ignore that regulations and benefit could have positive or negative correlation with increases in social welfare. And here, besides Christian and I can cite the comments by Christina Romer, James Stock, Elie Fennikel, Cameron Hepburn, Nicholas Stern, and Joseph Stiglitz. This implies that regulations with net benefits that negatively correlate with increases in social welfare would have risk-inclusive discount rates that are lower than the estimate of the risk-free discounting, All in all, the OMB concludes that as a general rule, and here I'm quoting, the discount rate should not be adjusted to account for the uncertainty of future benefits and costs. Instead, allowance for uncertainty should be made by adjusting the monetary values of changes in benefits and costs for the year in which they occur, so that they are expressed in terms of their certainty equivalents. But the UNB recognizes that when certainty equivalents are not calculated in a way that fully captures risk, including both idiosyncratic and systematic risks, risk should be thought of like other regulatory effects for which agencies lack reliable measurements. That is, as a non-monetized benefit and cost. OMB believes that it would be inappropriate to advise agencies at this time as a default to add a risk premium that cannot be well justified on the basis of the current economic literature. And it calls for academics to develop an even more better quantification as the economic literature develops. A third concern, I think I'm almost on time, is that we raise in our comments is that using a single discount rate for all projects is inappropriate insofar as risks differ between projects. Such a decision procedure yields a vast underinvestment in actions whose risk-adjusted discount rate is below this single discount rate, and vice versa. The welfare loss, as shown by Christian in 2022, the welfare loss of this misallocation of capital in the economy is potentially very large. Now, that's what the UNB is in fact recommending, the use of a single discount rate, except in exceptional cases. I'll come back to that later on. 25% of economists surveyed by Christian and his co-authors in 2023 support or claim first that the government can raise capital at lower interest rate than the risk-adjusted discount rate, namely at the risk-free rate, and should therefore use this latter rate as discount rate. 25% of professional economists state that in that survey. Second, that the extensive diversification of government actions and projects end up eliminating risk altogether. These are two arguments that we hear all the time. And the fact that 25% of professional economists do carry this message is kind of disturbing in a sense. Both proposed justifications are erroneous. The first one was dealt above in our first concern, and the second one is a negation of the fact that undiversifiable risk cannot be by definition be diversified, neither by government entities nor by private ones. Undiversifiable risks remain whatever is the level of diversification you try to. In the same vein, if a project is characterized by net benefits composed of different cash flow streams subject to different systematic risks, for instance, different systematic risk of revenue or benefits and cost streams that make up the total net benefits, it is necessary to discount the different components at different discount rates, as if there were different sub-projects before summing up the resulting discounted value. The Office of Management and Budget opens, but carefully, a door here to answer this concern. It claims that including the risk premium in the discount rate in the context of federal investments and other analysis subject to A94 captures the impact of systematic risk when conducting a finer grained certainty equivalent analysis for specific projects is not feasible. But you would have to show that it is not feasible before adjusting the discount rate. However, it asserts that in these cases, agencies should consult with the OMB for approval in using a different discount rate for a particular project. So it is very restricted, the possibility for agencies to move out of these guidelines, which are, in a sense, contrary to what most economists would expect, is something that is a bit disturbing. But it adds, the OMB adds also that agencies should be careful in the project evaluation and the analysis to apply consistent principles on discounting and risk, which may require using different discount rates for different costs and benefits, even within a project. So it recognizes the need to do it. But again, I mean, it favors this certainty equivalent valuation, and that these adjustments would be allowed only in cases for which certainty equivalent valuations are not calculated. And under what those conditions, the agencies would be allowed to move out of this no risk adjusted discount rate policy. A fourth concern is more generally related to certainty equivalent, the certainty equivalent approach. Although in theory, we say that we recognize that such an approach is compatible with risk-adjusted discounting of expected net benefits and should lead to similar decisions, the determination of certainty equivalent net benefits raises methodological issues that make it in general more cumbersome and less transparent. And I've seen it numerous times in practice in businesses where manipulation is easier in certainty equivalent approach than in risk adjusted discounting approach. I'm going to, now the OMB claims or believes that it can do better to take into account the systematic risk of a project or policy through a fine-grained, more flexible certainty equivalent approach than through a risk-adjusted discount rate approach. And again, most commenters disagree with this position of the OMB. A fifth concern, and this is going to be my last comment here, is that the standard risk-adjusted discounting of net benefits over the lifetime of the project ends up neglecting the potential value-creating active management of the policy, action, regulation, or project as time develops and new information becomes available. If you recognize the value-creating active management of a project, then the net present value is no more, or the risk-adjusted discounted value of net benefits, or however you frame it, you design it, is no longer appropriate and must be replaced by a real option valuation procedure. This real option valuation procedure raises important methodological challenges, but it should be mentioned as an alternative in the circulars, but there is no mention of it. And but there is a serious academic financial literature on this topic, and the OMB should review it in order to implement it when necessary. I'm thinking of Dixit and Pendyke and Chevalier-Roignan and Trigeorgis in particular, but others also. This question is not addressed in the OMB analysis of circulars A4 and A94. Other topics should have been addressed also. One is the risk-sharing procedures that is covered in public-private partnerships, which are quite frequent in government public projects. And when risk-sharing is done with private partners, we have both the government discounting at the risk-free rate, and we have the private partner discounting at risk-adjusted rate for the same project. Now, I don't have time to go into that, but I mean, this is something where there is some kind of an agreement between the two. Now, I should say as a conclusion that the social discount rate should be calculated using the estimated real risk-free rate plus a risk premium. Now, that's the OMB position, if certainty equivalents are not calculated. Discounted benefits and costs should be determined using a real discount rate of 1.7% if the benefit and cost reflect certainty equivalent valuations, and 2.8% if they do not, unless, and again, that the door which is barely open by the OMB, a project-specific risk premium is calculated, but the OMB is very restrictive on that. So in a sense, one rate fits all in general, and that's certainly not the proper policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcel. Very good.
Oh, I should have added in my introduction that all errors in what I've said are yours. And
okay, thank you. That's risk sharing. Marcel, thank you very much. Let me repeat you. At the end of Jim's presentation, you will be able to raise your hand or make a comment in the Q&A to ask for getting your mic on in order to raise your question. So prepare your question, and then we will take them as they arrive on my screen. So thank you very much, Marcel. And now, Jim, the final comments from you before we go to the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to follow with such distinguished panelists. So I'm going to give sort of maybe an overview and some general remarks on the subject, focusing on the OMB discounting. And my first point is just that discounting is complicated, and we cannot expect to use a single discount rate for all projects or all time horizons. And part of the reason it's complicated is because discounting necessarily combines two problems. One is representing intertemporal preferences for consequences that occur at different times, and uncertainty, because of course the future is always uncertain. So we have, in principle, two separate tools to deal with these two separate problems: discounting for intertemporal preferences and risk premia or certainty equivalents for dealing with uncertainty. But it's not clear how you can merge these two tools, because the present value of a certainty equivalent is not equal to the certainty equivalent of a present value of some stream. I think it's interesting that benefit cost analysis, in my view, is justified by relying on the Calvert-Hicks potential compensation test, in that we count monetary values of consequences equally, regardless of to whom they occur. In contrast, a lot of the discounting literature talks about the Ramsey rule, which is consistent with not Calvert-Hicks, but rather a utilitarian social welfare function, because it's adding utility across people rather than adding dollars across people. So I have two thoughts about why this might be the case. One, and probably the most important, is we cannot observe prices, which is to say interest rates, for long time horizons. So we have to model preferences in some way, or to model these trade-offs using assumptions about people's preferences. So that's why we get to the Ramsey rule. An alternative, though, could be for intertemporal projects, especially long time horizons, they're necessarily distributional. Obviously, that's the case for projects with intergenerational time horizons. And maybe we want to be equitable in considering the impacts on different generations. Okay. Circular A4 and naive 4 seem to suggest, or they say pretty clearly, that taking certainty equivalents is better than risk-adjusted discount rates, as especially Marcel has talked about. But the circulars seem to say you should take certainty equivalents of the project benefits or the costs, but this is not actually what's relevant. What we need is the certainty equivalent of total consumption with the project, and compare that to the certainty equivalent of total consumption without the project. Or more specifically, what we need is the difference in the certainty equivalent between the with project and without project cases. And so the point here is that the relevant uncertainty is not necessarily about the consequences of the project, but how the project uncertainty interacts with uncertainty about overall consumption or well-being or economic growth through the project horizon. So uncertainty about growth affects the discount rate for all projects. Uncertainty about the project itself, the project risk, only matters to the extent that that interacts with dependence on the uncertainty about the consumption growth. So one way to think about this is think of consumption growth over the relevant time horizon could be either high or low, and the future net benefits of the project when they're realized could be either high or low. If the project benefits are positively correlated with consumption growth, what that does is it essentially spreads out the possible future consumption levels because we pair high consumption growth with high project benefits and low consumption growth with low benefits. So that's just moving out the extremes of the distribution of future consumption, increasing risk. So that's less attractive, and we want to evaluate it with a larger discount rate than the opposite case where the project benefits are negatively correlated with consumption growth. So if you have high growth paired with low benefits from the project, or low growth paired with high benefits from the project, that decreases the spread of total consumption. So it's decreasing risk. It's more attractive. So we want to value that at a lower discount rate. And then if the project net benefits are uncorrelated with economic growth, the project itself just adds a little bit of noise to consumption. And when we're thinking of projects whose benefits are small compared with total consumption, as almost all projects are, this will just have a negligible effect on well-being. So it's just another way of saying that systemic risk, so correlated with overall growth, has a first-order effect on well-being, but idiosyncratic or non-systemic risk has only a second-order effect on well-being and can be generally ignored in applied benefit cost analysis. This also implies directly that uncertainty about the consumption growth rate is not very important for projects with only short time horizons, as the realized future consumption is not going to be very uncertain over a short time period. Now, the risk of a project, the risk of its consequences depend on socioeconomic events. So the project might pay off in some bad states of the world, but not in others. A simple example would be some climate adaptation projects will protect an area from sea level rise, but won't do anything to protect that area from heat, and other projects would do the reverse. So when we talk about correlation of project benefits with consumption growth, those are really kind of two big aggregates. And we need to, in some cases anyway, break those down into a lot more detail. So it may be useful to conduct some relatively detailed modeling of future consumption growth and its uncertainty in the different components, and also relatively detailed modeling of the project consequences, rather than just assuming, say, that the consumption growth rate is normally distributed. And this relates to one of the points Marcel made, that it may be necessary to discount different components of a project at different rates because they interact differently with uncertainty about future growth. One way we think about the correlation of project benefits with overall growth is the beta. We talk about the climate beta, for example. So here I want to point out that the beta could well vary over time. So at different horizons, there would be a different beta that will be relevant. The OMB guidance seems to think that a risk-adjusted rate would have to be constant, but if the beta differs with time horizon, that would be one reason for the discount rate to vary with time horizon. So one example would be that if you have some transport infrastructure project, which is sort of a discrete thing, so you build it, when it's brand new, it will be underutilized. And so the benefits of that project will have a high beta because they will be highly dependent on how much consumption grows in the period. But over time, as growth goes on and the project becomes fully utilized, its utilization rate may be more or less independent of consumption growth. So the beta would be high in the near term and would fall in the longer term. This idea of the climate beta, the extent to which climate damages are correlated with economic growth, is obviously hugely important for evaluating social cost of carbon. And I think David's results were suggesting climate beta is positive, meaning damages will be higher if economic growth has been larger. And I know a lot of papers get this result. To some extent, it's baked into a lot of the integrated assessment models, and the damages are proportional to the size of the economy. But it seems to be counterintuitive. And it's important to know what the sign of climate beta is, I think, because it seems intuitive that industrialization makes an economy much less sensitive to climate change than a non-industrialized economy. For example, in an industrialized economy, a much smaller share of the total product is produced through agriculture and other climate-sensitive sectors. An important innovation, I think, in the OMB guidance has to do with the shadow price of capital. So the issue here is the extent to which regulations or government projects may displace capital investment. Work by Billy Pizer and his colleagues suggests the shadow price of capital is only about 1.2, and the OMB has adopted this as sort of an upper bound estimate. So that means that whether a regulation displaces investment isn't actually quantitatively very important, I think, to the evaluation of it. So a factor of 1.2 and costs or benefits is pretty small compared with many uncertainties we face. So I want to highlight that this is, I think, a very big change of the new OMB guidance. The previous Circular A4 said projects should be discounted at two different rates, 3% and 7% per year. And these were justified as estimates of the social rate of time preference and of the opportunity cost of capital. So these have been effectively changed now to, we use the default risk adjustment base case of 3.1%. And then if we assume the project is just displacing investment 100%, we multiply that by 1.2. So we go from 3.1 to 3.7% discount rate. So really a very, very minimal effect on the evaluation. I want to highlight here that the problem of defining and modeling consumption growth. So we talk about C sub T as per capita consumption, but consumption is, of course, highly multidimensional. It consists of many goods and services, some of which will be either introduced or discontinued over the relevant time horizon for intergenerational projects. Also, consumption, we really mean things that contribute to total well-being. So it includes a lot of non-market goods, things like health status and environmental quality. So the contribution of the project consequences to well-being, or what we call consumption in the model, may depend on multiple inputs to utility, both their levels and uncertainty about their change. So how health and longevity might change over time could influence the marginal utility associated with different project benefits. This is related to the problem of how do we measure inflation when prices of goods and services change at different rates and the composition of total consumption changes. In general, let me just wrap up by saying the approach that the National Academy report that David Anthoff mentioned recommended for discounting was you could do Monte Carlo analysis where you have different scenarios of economic growth and project consequences. And within each one of those scenarios, you would discount at a scenario-specific rate that depends on the economic growth rate and the correlation of the benefits with the economic growth. And so you would calculate the present value, say, of the damages from climate change along each scenario using a scenario appropriate discount rate, and then you take the expected value across that. So that allows you to, in principle, account for these interactions between the components of the project and the components of economic growth and the correlation between them. And if I understand correctly, this is what David and his colleagues did on the Berkeley RFF team. So that seems to me like intuitively a very good approach and practically a very good approach if you have the resources and can justify the resources for that. Otherwise, the alternatives we're talking about, like risk-adjusted discount rate, are, I think, useful shortcuts, but we need to be sort of evaluate the accuracy of these shortcuts in different contexts. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, with the webinar, we don't have ability to organize a round of applause, but you devoted it, all my three panelists. So remember, so the thing, maybe those who want to raise a question, put your name in the Q&A, and I will give you the mic. So before that, let me try to summarize the three panelists' posture on the US discounting system. So I understand that the three of you agree on the importance of taking into account of the risk of the project itself and the risk of the general, economic growth, and so we are all uneasy with the solution proposed by the UMB, which consists in adjusting the flow of certainty equivalence at the risk-free rate. So we agree on that in theory. That could lead to exactly the same result that is proposed by a modern version of the consumption-based capital asset pricing model that solves the standard asset pricing puzzles. But that requires probably a lot of work and probably too much complexity for most policy evaluation. So the beauty of the beta approach, the beauty of the consumption-based capital asset pricing model is that you just need to estimate, quote unquote, just need to estimate the beta of your project to determine what discount rate to be used for discounting the flow of expected net benefits. The certainty equivalent approach is problematic because first, there is a risk of incoherence. Remember, the CCAPM gives you a coherent approach to solve at the same time, as Jim said. I mean, at the same time, you solve the time aggregation problem with the risk aggregation problem. But the two are consistent because it uses the same belief, probabilistic approach in representing the belief about the risk of your project and the risk of macroeconomic growth. And that's a benefit. With this alternative approach proposed by the UMB, there is a risk that the architecture you use to estimate certainty equivalent of your future benefit is incompatible with the estimation of the risk-free rate that is generated by this probabilistic approach to representing beliefs on future growth. So there is a risk associated to this potential incoherence. So the first thing. Second thing, I think we agree on the fact that the certainty equivalent approach proposed by the UMB raise a question associated to the measure of the impact of risk on the valuation, the present valuation. And there I have a question for David in particular. We know that if we represent our belief about the future using a normal distribution, log normal distribution for future consumption and future benefits, then we have this asset pricing puzzle, risk-free rate puzzle, and the equity premium puzzle. And so, and that's what will happen too in the certainty equivalent approach, where we will use the same ingredient probably, expected utility and normal distribution. I see in your calibration, David, that the size of the impact of risk on your estimation is not marginal, because you have the term structure of this risk premium, which is clearly not zero, in particular for the long run. So it must be that you integrate into your calibration of the scenarios potentially extreme event. And we know, and I have a paper with my co-authors, Aude Pommeret and Frédéric Charbonnier, a paper entitled Stress Discounting, using this stochastic discount factor approach that you use, David. We show that introducing extreme events, even with a low probability, has a large effect on the certainty equivalent, on the risk premium, and on the implicit discount rate, risk-free discount rate you use. So how do you calibrate, David, in the social cost of carbon valuation? How do you take into account of those extreme? Do you integrate extreme event in your modeling?
All right, you go to the hard questions right away.
Well, that's an important one, I think.
It's an important one, yeah. So maybe I'll say, can I split this into two different aspects, I think? I want to capture this. So one is, in all the approach that we've talked about today, I think, there is in the background this equity premium puzzle problem that in the standard consumption-based capital asset pricing model, at least as far as I understand the literature, you have a problem explaining the spread between observed risk-adjusted and risk-free rates. And so we do not resolve that here, right? That is, we live with that problem in our calibration as well. The way the discounting module was calibrated is that it was calibrated to match the risk-free rate, and then it endogenously computes a risk-adjusted rate. But we know that the model that we're using in other contexts, namely for market returns, will generate a risk premium that is, or a risk-adjusted rate that is not large enough, right? So that is, and I think Bill Nordhaus pointed that out, that is sort of in his latest work. I don't have a really very good answer to this problem, because this to me strikes me as a little bit of as an area where the literature on asset pricing is still not fully resolved. Some people recommend that one should use Epstein-Zinn preferences to solve this problem, but that comes with its own bag of problems. I don't know. So those of you who have looked into this, there are these timing premia that I think are a problem. So it's not that. So I think from my point of view, we don't have a clear, this is how we resolve this problem. You can just use it off the shelf. So you have to make some trade-off here. And this is what we made, right? So what we did.
Yeah, on this Epstein-Zinn, David, if you allow me to intervene at this stage, I am not happy with using Epstein-Zinn preferences when we do normative analysis of policies, because our ethical approach to how do we transfer consumption power across people, across generation, across different states of nature, we assume. We take this impartiality posture of a veil of ignorance, and the veil of ignorance transforms inequalities across time, which is central to the Ramsey rule and to the reason why we penalize the future. This temporal or intergenerational inequalities is risk, and therefore risk aversion and inequality aversion, which is in the Ramsey rule, should be the same thing. So I am not happy with the Epstein-Zinn reference. That's why I like this approach using extreme events, extreme scenarios.
Yeah. So I think Yeah, so from my point of view, yeah, so we didn't go Epps times in, for a different reason than you just mentioned, right? So the reason, there are technical reasons also why we didn't do that. But I think there's sort of, okay, so it's from my point of view, there's not like a clear winner for which model you should use in the asset pricing mold. And so I think what we picked at the end is theoretically very consistent. I think it's a reasonable calibration, but I'm also aware that I think you can quibble with that. Now, let me say something about the extreme events, because that's actually really interesting, and a caveat that I probably should have mentioned about the rates that I showed. And this is something we're looking into right now, so I cannot give you a definitive answer, but we are seeing in the distributions of some of the decomposed parts fat tails in our modeling results. So if we look at the combined distribution for stochastic discount factor times payoff, there's no fat tail here. So taking expectations works, it's all great. But if we look at these distributions individually, so the distribution for the stochastic discount factor and the distribution for the marginal impacts, then we think that we might actually have some fat tails in there. And so those are extreme events. And that probably generate, I don't have a definitive answer for that, but I do think that that might explain the divergence, some of the divergence that we see between the risk-adjusted and the risk-free rate.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David.
Yeah, so I think that's the answer there.
I think you should definitely write a paper on that, because this estimation of the social cost of carbon using your method of the social discount, the stochastic discount rate, is discount factor is something that I think is promising, and promising. It could be useful for other application. Marcel.
Yeah, I would like simply to say here that regarding these extreme events, the real options approach is in a way a procedure to take into account these events, because the real options approach says that we start the project and then we make adjustment as information. If these extreme events seem to be materializing, then we can take action at that point. But if we do not start the project now, we won't be able to react at that time. And in a sense, it's a way to bring in, it's a methodology, I would say, to take into account the fact that the way to take into account these extreme events, if they materialize in the future, is to start now with the average or the expected projects, realize the projects based on expected values and so on. But still, I mean, I don't want to go too far in this.
That's interesting. Thank you, Marcel. Richard Toll asks for waited much time to raise this question. Richard, yes, your mic is on. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks for this. Part of what I was going to say actually was raised by you, Christian, but very briefly, so I would like you guys to elaborate. I think that Jim was right that discounting is difficult because you sort of conflate risk and time. But then David applied the discount rate to climate change, particularly the social cost of carbon, where you actually have a third dimension, or maybe a fourth dimension as well, and that is that you're discounting the welfare of not only people who have very different incomes at a start, but also grow or are expected to grow at very different rates. And I would like David to elaborate on how they solve this in their advice for the social cost of carbon to the US government, but particularly, perhaps more importantly, also to elaborate how perhaps this could have been done better.
David?
Yeah, okay. Thanks for, so good to hear your voice, Richard. It's been a while. And thanks for that question. So this is actually I was going to talk about it, but then I knew already I was over 20 minutes, so I cut that part. So what we did in this, so this goes to this whole, I think all the question of, do people have different marginal utility values in different parts of the world at one given point in time? And should we adjust this? I think in the climate econ literature, this has been discussed as equity weighting for a long time. And Richard has done some of the very early work on that. When I started my PhD, Richard pulled me into that, so I've done work there. And okay, so the work we did for the U.S. government does not use equity weighting, and it runs under different names now: distributional weighting or income weighting. We take world total damages, world average per capita consumption, and then apply the discounting machinery on that. And that was, quite frankly, because came out of the National Academy's report, a recommendation. And when we started working with EPA, that was sort of the setting. And that's really a Calder-Hicks setting, right? You don't take distributional concerns into account. An interesting thing, though, is that the new A4 has a section now that allows agencies to do what they call income weighting of costs and benefits, which is essentially exactly the same thing as what we called equity weighting and the social cost of carbon. So that is actually on the books now at the US federal government, which if you had asked me 5 years ago whether that will ever happen, I would have taken any bet that this is not in the cards. And I think that's great. I think these distributional questions are really important. It is not reflected at all in our work for the social cost of carbon. We do have a manuscript under review that is, I think, very close to getting out, so fingers crossed, where we show what this type of income weighting as proposed by A4 would do to our social cost of carbon estimate from the GIVE model. And let me just say, it's dramatic.
Okay, thank you.
If you think that going from 50 to 190 was large, wait until we show you what happens if you do the income.
Very nice advertisement on your work, David. I'm eager to read this. Yes, I agree with you and with Richard. I mean, it's impressive to see how important the importance we put on discounting using the Ramsey rule. And remember, the Ramsey rule is distributional weights. I mean, we penalize the future because we believe future generation will be wealthier, and so we do not consider $1 for them as $1 for us who are poor. So it's impressive to see how important is discounting in our cost-benefit analysis, and at the same time we completely ignore intragenerational inequality. So that's quite fascinating, and I agree with you. It's important to correct that in the future. Is there any other question? I have one question from the Q&A about what will happen, and probably Jim and David are better informed than Marcel and I. What will happen if we get, a lunatic at the White House, climate lunatic at the White House starting next year? Should we expect a new revision of the discounting system in the US? Because after all, this change is radical. It's radically transformed the way the US people will contemplate the impacts of your efforts and sacrifices for the benefits of the distant future. So something I'm not sure Donald Trump is very happy about. So what will happen in that scenario? And that's an extreme event. Huh?
Jim, you have to go first.
Well, that's a very unhappy thought. Certainly I and most of us have learned a lot more about the possibility of extreme events in our politics and societies over the last 10 or so years. But specifically what you're talking about, I don't think there would be much effort in such a scenario put into revising A4, and much more likely just ignore the rules and the principles and do things without following the framework that's been established. And they just mentioned the executive orders that require the US federal agencies to do regulatory impact analysis were put in place by Ronald Reagan at the very start of his administration, 1981. And actually, they've been revised, updated, but every single president, including the previous one, followed them, or at least did not revoke them. So there's been a huge amount of stability in that form.
Yeah, but however, I mean, Donald Trump in his previous administration decided to reduce, I mean, I don't know whether it's he or his councillors that reduced the social cost of carbon to one or $8 per ton.
Yeah. No, I don't think, but in the previous, he didn't revise the guidance documents. They just did what they want to get the policy answer. And
Well, he imposed the use of the discount rate of 7%,
sure.
particular.
I think this is, I have one thought on this,
Yeah.
and I think this is, and I'm not just sort of maybe sort of, there is a legal component to all of this. So so for those of us who have worked with EPA when this kind of stuff is developed, there's always considerations, will this hold up in court? And so I don't have a good understanding of that, but I think it would be really interesting conversation with someone who does understand the legal framework here, how sticky these documents are from a legal point of view. Because I think while an administration might come in and might want to sort of erase everything, there are some constraints and they might be too slow or they might not be effective enough. And I don't understand that. But I think that is probably would be a really interesting question. How much, how much degree of freedom does an administration actually really have to go in there and change everything very quickly, radically?
Okay, my friends, you know what? It's time to close this session. Let me say let me again thank you for your contribution. Let me say hello to all my colleagues that I see in the participation list. Larry, Julien, and so many others. It's good to see this that my webinars are there's some interest from my colleagues and in particular from the experts in the field. And that's the objective. I think it is useful to have this discussion and pursue it to see whether what is improvable. In particular, in France, we have now a new revision of the social cost of carbon, and I see Alain Quinet among the members. He is the chairman of the committee in charge of revising the social cost of carbon for France. So I'm sure he took some notes of what we were saying today. So to conclude, let me say one important thing. I mean, this revision from the past 7% or 7 and 3%, whatever, I never understood when the 7% should have been used or the 3% should have been used. But moving to this clarification where we reduce the discount rate, saying it's a risk-free discount rate, and we need to take into account of the risk of the project in one way or another. I'm not completely happy with the proposal, but at least this is a clarification that is probably something much better than the previous discounting system in the US. So we should not let the tree hide the forest and saying, oh, no, this is not good. We are economists. We are never completely happy. We also always find something better to do. That's our job. But so let us celebrate this transformation and recognize that the new system is much better than the previous one, and to end up with another positive comment. Maybe the solution for the future, for the next revision of the OMB discounting system, is to go through this stochastic discount factor that has been presented by David today. So thank you so much, all of you, and see you for the next webinar in the next few weeks from now. Thank you very much. Bye bye.